get that when you make those assertions? Where do you get the research then to back that up? What kind of sources do you go to?
Well, there's some excellent data that can be found through the Sentencing Project. The Sentencing Project, based here in D.C., has done a fantastic job of analyzing and publicizing through its reports all of the data that the Department of Justice publishes on an annual basis. So this is based on the government's own statistics and many of the reports that have been done by the Sentencing Project.
To calls, Atlanta is first on our Democrats line. James, you're on with Michelle Alexander. She's the author of The New Jim Crow. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I found out that the census count these prisoners in the county that they're in, and some of their monies from the federal government and the representatives that's determined by the census count. That count goes toward that, but they can't vote. How is it they should get credit for that prisoner, and monies be allocated to them for that count?
Yes, you're absolutely right. What you're referring to is the practice of the Census Bureau of counting prisoners in the counties in which the prisons are located, rather than counting them as residents of their home communities. So, you know, in states like New York, for example, the overwhelming majority of prisoners come from New York City and other urban areas. But most of the prisons in New York are in predominantly white rural areas. So this census rule, the census practice, means that, you know, all of those black and brown folks who are warehoused in prisons in white rural areas are counted as members of the kind of local population in these white rural counties, even though they're barred from voting. And because they're counted in these white rural communities, it means that extra resources and state funding is granted to those communities because their population is inflated. The population count is inflated as a result of prisons being located. But it also means that those counties, through redistricting, get additional state representatives, you know, representing them in the legislature. So the poor communities of color from which these folks you know, are taken, lose representatives, while the white rural counties that house prisons get additional state representatives, even though the people who are, you know, supposedly residents there don't even have the right to vote.
Cleveland, Ohio, you are next. Jennifer on our Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. Hi, Michelle. I just wanted to thank you for at least touching on a subject that I've always felt kind of strongly about, the justice system, particularly as it pertains to drugs. In a way, it seems like it's a wasted commodity, that drug dealers can, in a way, be more entrepreneurial. However, I mean, why does it have to be so racial just because everybody in jail, you know, happens to, the makeup of the demographic background happens to be predominantly black and Latino and some white, and then you refer to them as taken, as if they're taken captive? Do you just totally discredit the idea that they broke the law? And I totally agree with you about the felon and having a record and not being able to get a job. However, I mean, rather than being racial about it and partisan and saying Republicans are racist, like Reagan, by doing the drug laws, why not address the rehabilitation measures as opposed to blaming it on a party and calling everybody racist? I mean, you know, it's the law, and laws are set up to protect us. Do you suggest just not having laws to protect the people, not having laws to keep people? This is a civil society. We're supposed to follow laws. I mean, what do you suggest other than calling people racist? Why can't we have different rehabilitation measures, specifically training people who are in there for drug dealing to use those skills that they learned as drug dealing into the community to own their own business?
Caller, thank you. We'll let our guest respond.
Well, my concern here is that young people of color in particular are being targeted and branded as felons at young ages. You know, a form of branding that will alter the course of their entire lives for engaging in minor drug activity. The very kinds of activity that goes on in suburban communities, middle-class white communities, colleges and universities all the time. And those kids aren't asked to forfeit the rest of their lives because they made a mistake and, you know, were experimenting with pot or experimenting with drugs or sold, you know, some drugs to their friends. In middle-class white communities, it's understood that kids make mistakes, adults make mistakes, and when it comes to drug use in particular, why should anyone who uses drugs be put in a cage, and then released to a permanent second-class status in which they're subjected to discrimination, scorn, and exclusion for the rest of their life? It's just an utterly irresponsible and unnecessarily punitive response to what amounts to a public health problem. You know, I don't think most Americans would want anyone they cared about who had a drug problem to be put in a cage. I don't think most Americans would want anyone they cared about to be subjected to discrimination for the rest of their life simply because they broke the law once. But in our society, it appears we don't care that much about kids in the ghetto. Kids who are black and brown, living in communities that are racially segregated and which it's become normal for their parents to do time in prison, and when they're stopped and searched on their way to school and on their way home and driving in cars. This has become normal in these communities, part of what it means to be black in America. And, you know, we as a nation hold ourselves out as an example of, you know, racial equality and freedom in the world, and we shouldn't have a system in this country that relegates young people of color in particular to a lifetime of social and economic marginalization simply because they were once caught with drugs.
Columbus, Ohio, next. Valerie on our independent line. Valerie, are you there? One more time for Columbus, Ohio.
Hi, good morning, and thank God for C-SPAN. Yes, I am.
Go ahead, and caller, if you would just turn down your television so you don't get feedback.
Yes, okay. I have a question here. And I read maybe a couple of years ago that in comparison, if you have an African-American male that's graduated from high school and college and has a clean background, and then you take a Caucasian male who just has a high school education and has a drug background, he will more than likely get the job before the African American. And the second question I have, do you think it's a lot of harm being done to the African American community by a lot of the shows that are coming on, these crime shows that depict African American youth as being drug dealers?
Yes. You're absolutely right that studies that have recently been conducted indicate that an African American without a criminal record will have a harder time getting a job, than, you know, a white male that has a criminal record. And this shows, you know, kind of the profound disadvantage that African American men in particular kind of face in the employment market today. African American men both kind of suffer racial stigma and racial discrimination, but they also, far too often, have been branded felons. And, you know, in the current job market where people who don't have criminal records have a very hard time getting a job, imagine what the odds are for young folks of color who have been branded felons. What are the chances that they'll be able to find meaningful work in the current economy?
Our guest, again, the book is The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration and the Age of Colorblindness.